In 1984, the NeverEnding Story appeared on screen like a fairy tale made for children. But that was only the surface. Behind the luck dragon, the ivory tower, and the language of magical wishes was a film born out of conflict, fear, and shooting days that left the cast and crew nearly exhausted. This movie tells the story of a boy who escapes into a book to run from the pain of losing his mother. But what is strange is that the film itself carried a very real wound of its own. The author of the original novel hated the adaptation so much that he took the filmmakers to court. A horse nearly lost its life during the film's most famous scene, and one young actress, after becoming a childhood icon for millions, ended up facing fan letters no child should ever have to read. If you only remember The NeverEnding Story as a beautiful dream from the 1980s, then it is time to look at it another way. Because Fantasia was not built with magic. It was built with money running out, equipment constantly breaking down, children pushed into punishing shooting schedules, and a nearly reckless belief that this story deserved to exist. Today, we are going to walk through 20 of the strangest, darkest, and most haunting secrets behind the NeverEnding Story. And the deeper you go into Fantasia, the more clearly you begin to see one thing. This world was never as dazzling as it looked on screen. Number 1. The man who created Fantasia once tried to stop this very movie from being released. The first shock in this story does not begin on the set. It begins with Michael Ende himself, the author of the original novel. For many viewers, The NeverEnding Story is a childhood movie. But for Ende, it was something deeply personal, a meditation on grief, imagination, and how easily a person can lose themselves. So when the film adaptation stripped away many of the layers of meaning he considered the soul of the book, Ende was not merely disappointed. He was furious. He publicly criticized the movie, demanded that his name be removed from the credits, and even filed a lawsuit to try to stop it from being released. In his eyes, this was no longer his story. It had been softened, commercialized, and stripped of its deepest pain. But the lawsuit failed. The movie still made it to theaters. Children around the world fell in love with it, and the man who created Fantasia could only watch from the outside. It is a deeply sad paradox. A fantasy world that captivated millions was born under the fierce rejection of its own creator. And worse than that, the sense of betrayal did not come from one minor detail. It came from the fact that the film changed almost the entire center of gravity of the story. Number 2. The movie we know actually tells only half the story. Most audiences remember The NeverEnding Story as a journey to save Fantasia. Bastian reads the book, Atreyu fights on, the world is saved, and the luck dragon carries everything back into the sky. It feels complete. But in Michael Ende's novel, that is only the midpoint of the story. The second half of the book is where Bastian truly enters Fantasia, and that is also where the story becomes much more dangerous. The once weak boy begins using the power of wishes, and little by little, those wishes begin to corrupt him. Every wish granted takes away part of his memory and part of his true self. Bastian does not simply grow stronger, he becomes arrogant, selfish, and slowly loses himself. The film cuts out that entire arc. Put simply, the movie keeps the more accessible portion, the part that feels like a magical rescue. The section that turns Bastian into a warning about ego and escapism is left behind. That is why Michael Ende did not criticize the film simply because it was different from the book. He believed the movie had changed the story's central message. But if you think that was the biggest cut of all, wait until you get to the material removed from the very beginning. The part that should have helped us understand just how much pain Bastian was in. Number 3. Why Bastian had to hide inside that book. One thing many people never realized is that the English language version American audiences grew up with was not exactly the same as the original German version. It was shortened, and one of the most important missing pieces was right at the beginning. It was the breakfast scene between Bastian and his father after the death of his mother. There is no magic, no monster, no fantasy spectacle. Just a cold kitchen, an awkward conversation, and a boy sinking into grief that the adults around him do not know how to touch. That scene makes it clear that Bastian does not read the book out of simple curiosity. He is looking for somewhere to hide. When that scene was cut from the American release, the adventure remained intact. But the emotional wound inside Bastian became much harder to see. Viewers still followed him into Fantasia, but they could feel less of why Fantasia mattered so desperately to him in the first place. It is a small change in running time, but a major emotional loss. Number 4. A giant cinematic gamble that could have dragged an entire studio down with it. At that time, West Germany had very little precedent for a fantasy movie on the scale of the NeverEnding Story. A $25 million budget in the early 1980s was enormous, not just for a German film, but for Europe as a whole. And the problem was, this film was not being made with cheap tricks. It required massive sets, complex mechanical creatures, miniatures, cable rigs, fake mud, real fire, real water, and months of constant troubleshooting. Falcor alone required an entire team to operate. The Swamps of Sadness took weeks, and the shooting schedule kept stretching further and further. Every day that passed meant more money added to the total. By the final stage, this was no longer just an ambitious movie. It was a gamble that, if it failed, could have buried the reputation and careers of many people involved. By this point, you can start to see why the NeverEnding Story was never as magical as it looked on the surface. It was a miracle built right at the edge of financial disaster. At that moment, Fantasia no longer looked like a dreamland. It started to reveal itself as a giant machine full of cracks, where every production cut, every growing expense, and every creative argument had the power to bring the entire dream crashing down. Number 5. Artax sinking was not nearly as safe as many people think. If there is one scene that shattered an entire generation of viewers, it is the moment Artax slowly sinks into the swamps of sadness. For children of the 1980s, it was not just a sad scene. For many, it was the first time they realized a fantasy film could hurt like losing something real. Over the years, all kinds of rumors appeared, including the claim that the horse actually died. That is not true, but the truth is still disturbing. The scene was filmed using a lift mechanism hidden beneath the mud to make the horse sink gradually. The problem was that the system malfunctioned. The animal panicked, struggled, and had trouble getting free, and the entire set went into emergency mode. People who were there later described it as one of the worst shooting days of the entire production. Artax survived, but the shock of that day left a heavy mark on the crew, on Noah Hathaway, and on the way people later looked back at the scene. Because that swamp was not just a symbol of sadness. For several terrifying minutes, it became a genuinely dangerous place. But if you think that was the scariest moment for the film's young actors, wait until the boy playing Atreyu had to face a giant steel mechanical wolf. Number 6. Noah Hathaway practically had to survive the movie the same way Atreyu did. Noah Hathaway was only 12 years old when he took on the role of Atreyu, but the shooting schedule did not treat him like a child. He had to learn horseback riding, swimming, sword fighting, wire work, cold water scenes, and repeated takes of physically demanding action. Then came the confrontation with Gmork, the giant mechanical wolf made of steel and hydraulics. It is one of the most frightening images in the movie, and it was also one of the most dangerous things on set. During filming, the machine malfunctioned. A metal component scraped across Noah's face, coming dangerously close to his eye. He had to be hospitalized and stitched up. That scar is still there today. What makes it even more remarkable is that Noah came back and finished the film. On screen, Atreyu is the young warrior brave enough to step into darkness. In real life, Noah Hathaway was doing almost the same thing, only not inside Fantasia, but on the set itself. Number 7. Audiences never heard the real voice of the boy who bled for the role. Noah Hathaway's story has another detail that shocks a lot of fans when they hear it later. For many years, audiences believed they remembered Atreyu's voice. But in truth, much of Noah's dialogue in the movie was dubbed by another actor. The reason given was that his real voice sounded too high for the image the studio wanted audiences to have of Atreyu. On the surface, that may sound like a small issue, but the more you think about it, the sadder it becomes. A boy endured a punishing production schedule, suffered a real injury, pushed himself physically for the role, and in the end, his own voice was not kept. It is the kind of fact that changes the way people look at filmmaking. Because behind a heroic figure on screen, there is sometimes still just a child being shaped and reshaped by adults, right down to the sound of his voice. And then there was another child in this movie who also paid a price for fame. But her story is frightening in a completely different way. Number 8. Tammy Stronach's role became something her parents could not accept. Tammy Stronach was only 11 when she played the childlike Empress. She does not have much screen time, she does not get action scenes, and she is not riding dragons or running through swamps. But all she had to do was sit on her throne and speak a few lines, and she became one of the most iconic images in the entire movie. Then the film came out, and fame arrived immediately. That sounds like a fairy tale. But the other side of the story was much darker. Fan letters began to arrive, and many of them came from adult men with content no child should ever have to read. Worse, there were people in the industry who tried to push her toward roles that were far too mature, to the point that her parents stepped in and pulled their daughter out of that machine almost immediately. Tammy nearly disappeared from Hollywood after that. Not because she lacked potential, but because her parents understood that what was waiting behind the door of fame was not safe for a child. Number 9. Fantasia almost became a real-life disaster. If someone says the NeverEnding Story was made out of fire and smoke, that would be almost literally true. While filming the Southern Oracle scenes, the production used large amounts of lighting, sparks, and pyrotechnic effects to create that mystical feeling. But one of the pyrotechnic devices malfunctioned. Fire shot across the stage, part of the scaffolding caught fire, and the set immediately dropped into chaos. Thankfully, the emergency systems kicked in quickly enough that no one suffered major injuries. But after that incident, the set no longer felt like a place where people could walk in with full peace of mind. On screen, Fantasia still glowed with blue light and magical flashes. But the people behind it knew perfectly well that there were moments when this movie came dangerously close to a real accident. At that point, the NeverEnding Story no longer felt like a children's film. It began to reveal itself as a place where magic was bought with real endurance, real fear, and sometimes wounds that no one in the audience would ever see. Number 10. Wolfgang Petersen pushed the entire production to the limit. Wolfgang Petersen came into the NeverEnding Story after Das Boot, and he brought the same intense perfectionism with him. On this set, there was no such thing as good enough. Petersen wanted every movement, every emotional beat, every moment to appear exactly the way he imagined it. That sounds noble when you look at the finished movie, but on set, it meant dozens of retakes for the same scene. Some sequences took 30 or 40 takes. The Artax scene lasted 2 weeks. Mauler took even longer. A production schedule originally meant to last a few months stretched into almost a full year. For adults, that would already have been punishing. For child actors, it was even harder. Fatigue, frustration, tears, and pressure slowly became part of everyday life. At times, the line between performance and real exhaustion almost disappeared. But if you think the pressure came only from the workload, there was something else that made this movie especially unusual. Even some of its quietest scenes once stood on the edge of being cut completely. Number 11. The saddest line in the movie almost did not survive. One of the moments that makes the NeverEnding Story feel different from so many other children's fantasy movies is the scene where Rockbiter sits among the ruins and admits that his giant, powerful hands could not save his friends. That line is not loud. There is no fight scene. There is no swelling score. But it drives straight into the viewer's heart. The problem was, the studio did not like it at first. In the eyes of some executives, the scene was too heavy, too sad, too dark for children. They wanted the movie to move faster, feel brighter, breathe easier. But editor Jane Seitz saw the opposite. She understood that if this scene were cut, the movie would lose its deepest pain, the part that makes Fantasia more than just a beautiful place to escape into. It makes it a world where loss has real weight. In the end, the scene stayed. And that was an incredibly important decision. Because that moment is where the film says most clearly that sadness inside an imaginary world is still real sadness. Number 12. Falcor had to be redesigned because he was too frightening. Today, Falcor is one of the warmest creatures in fantasy film history. He feels more like a flying dog than a dragon. But what is interesting is that the earliest version of Falcor did not feel that way at all. Early designs pushed him closer to a more traditional dragon, colder, stranger, and much less friendly. Then the filmmakers realized something was off. In a story already filled with so much darkness, Fantasia needed at least one creature that made the audience feel embraced. So Falcor was redesigned. Softer fur, kinder eyes, a gentler face, an overall shape that felt more comforting and approachable. That was a small choice on the design table, but a huge shift emotionally. Falcor is not just a companion. He is a promise that even when everything is collapsing, there is still some part of Fantasia that wants to hold on to you with kindness. By this point, you can see why the movie did not succeed only because of ambition. It succeeded because it understood exactly which emotions needed to tighten and which ones needed to loosen so the audience could breathe. Number 13. Fantasia hides a secret crossover right inside the gathering of creatures. Among the darker parts of the movie, there is one small detail that is especially fun for sharp-eyed fans. In the scene where all the creatures gather at the ivory tower, if you look closely, you can spot some strange familiar faces hidden in the crowd. Shapes that resemble Yoda, Ewoks, E.T., or even Mickey Mouse appear in quick flashes, like playful inside jokes from the design team. This does not change the plot, but it shows that Fantasia was imagined as a place wide enough to contain fragments of other pop culture memories as well. Most children at the time would never have noticed, but when many fans grew up and re-watched the movie, they were startled to discover that the film had quietly hidden its own tiny crossover universe in plain sight. It is a very 1980s kind of Easter egg, mischievous, unexplained, and simply waiting for fans to discover it one day. Number 14. Moonchild became one of the movie's most famous mysteries. The emotional peak of the film comes when Bastian screams out a new name for the childlike empress and saves Fantasia. But for years, countless fans were never quite sure what they were hearing. Was it Moonchild? Was it Mum? Or was it some other word swallowed by the wind and the music? The truth is that in the original novel, the name is Moonchild, the name tied to Bastian's dead mother. It is a deeply healing choice. It connects the act of saving Fantasia to the deepest wound in the boy's life. But the film's sound mix turned that moment into a puzzle that lasted for decades. And so one of the most emotional details in the story became a pop culture mystery instead. This is the kind of strange accident that cinema can create. One unclear sound cue is enough to shift the way an entire generation understands a scene. Number 15. Spielberg helped shape the way the world saw the movie. Steven Spielberg is not usually the first name people mention when talking about the NeverEnding Story, but his role in helping the movie reach the world was not small. He supported the project, helped influence the pacing of the American release, and played a part in bringing the film closer to a storytelling rhythm more familiar to Hollywood audiences. As a thank you, the filmmakers gave him the original Aurin, the twin serpent medallion symbolizing the bond between Bastian and Fantasia. According to stories told later, Spielberg kept it on his desk as a memento from a world he had helped bring to American audiences. This detail is not as shocking as the accidents on set, but it shows that the film did not survive on effects and design alone. It also survived because of people who believed that such a strange, sad, deeply European story could still touch the hearts of mainstream audiences. At this point, the NeverEnding Story reveals a very beautiful truth. It was not made only with technology or money. It was made with hundreds of small decisions about emotion, tone, and belief. If those had shifted even slightly, Fantasia might never have become Fantasia at all. Number 16. An unexpected victory worth hundreds of millions. If you look at it through pure market logic, The NeverEnding Story was a baffling gamble. A German fantasy film shot in Munich, full of strange creatures, hard to pronounce names, a story rhythm filled with quiet pauses, and a tone that did not constantly spoon-feed young audiences with cheerfulness. And yet, it still soared. The movie earned more than $100 million worldwide and became one of the strongest performing foreign-made films in the American market at the time. What makes that even stranger is that it did it without relying on toy lines, without a giant franchise backing it up, and without following the usual Hollywood formula. Young audiences at the time did not come to Fantasia because it was easy. They came because it trusted that children could handle sadness, could understand loss, and could see themselves in a shy boy hiding in an attic with a book. Number 17. The theme song almost slipped into oblivion. The theme song from The NeverEnding Story is the kind of melody that brings an entire era rushing back the instant it starts. Written by Giorgio Moroder and performed by Limahal, it carries exactly the fantasy pop spirit of the 1980s. Dreamy, a little cheesy, but unbelievably unforgettable. The song became a hit in Europe, then gradually turned into an object of nostalgia. It was still there, but like a small lamp buried deep in collective memory. Then in 2019, Stranger Things pulled it back into the spotlight with a scene that was awkward and adorable at the same time, and suddenly the song exploded all over again. Streams surged. A new generation started singing the same melody their parents once knew by heart. That is what only truly durable songs can do. Sleep for decades, then wake up as if they had never aged at all. But it was not just the music. Another name from this movie kept living on somewhere even more unexpected, in the world of metalcore. Number 18. Atreyu also became the name of a band. In the late 1990s, 5 young men in California formed a metalcore band and named it Atreyu. That was not random. To them, the character was not just a childhood memory. Atreyu was a symbol of courage, of walking into darkness, even when you know you might lose. That band later found success, and the name Atreyu went on to live a second life, louder, rougher, more aggressive, but still born from the same long-haired young warrior of Fantasia. What is especially interesting is that the band members openly said they never cared much for the later sequels. To them, the original was the one worth honoring. That may sound like a small detail, but it is actually a very clear sign of just how deeply this movie rooted itself in pop culture. Number 19. The franchise kept going, but the soul did not. The success of the first movie naturally made people want more. And so The NeverEnding Story got a second film, then a third, an animated series, and other spin-off attempts. But none of them ever recreated the emotional power of the 1984 original. The tone shifted, the cast changed, the mythology expanded, but the heart of the story grew thinner. Fans were confused, and critics became colder and colder. It is a sharp reminder that a fantasy world cannot survive on a title or recognizable symbols alone. Once you lose the pain, the fragility, and the trust in children that made the original special, Fantasia becomes little more than a shell. Sometimes a great story does not need to be stretched forever. It only needs to keep the first soul that made it matter. Number 20. The movie became a shared dream for children all over the world. The most astonishing thing about The NeverEnding Story may not be its effects or its box office, but the way it crossed borders. The film was dubbed into more than 30 languages, released all over the world, and reached children from very different cultures through the same simple structure: a lonely child, a dying world, and the belief that imagination might be able to save them both. In some places, audiences remember Moonchild. In others, they remember Artax. In others, they remember Falcor. But no matter the language, the feeling the movie leaves behind is remarkably similar. It makes children cry. It makes them dream. It makes them want to hold on to the story longer by finding the book, replaying the song, or watching the movie one more time. That is the moment when a film stops belonging to just one country and becomes a shared memory for an entire generation. Bonus fact, Falcor is still there, and you can still sit on his back. Most of the things that created Fantasia were taken apart after filming ended. Sets disappeared. Creatures were dismantled. The dream was packed away into storage. But Falcor was different. That original puppet, which was 43 feet long, was preserved. Today, at Bavaria Film in Munich, fans can still see Falcor and even sit on his back. It is a strange and beautiful moment. Because in a world where most movie magic survives only in memory, there is still one luck dragon left behind to remind you that sometimes a few pieces of Fantasia really did survive. The NeverEnding Story is not just a fantasy film. It is a story about grief, escape, memory, and the cost of believing in another world long enough for it to start changing you. It was born from arguments, nearly collapsed under the weight of its own ambition, hurt more than a few people in the process of creating its magic, and still became one of the most universal stories of the 1980s. Out of all these secrets, which detail surprised you the most? Leave a comment below, and if you want me to keep uncovering behind-the-scenes truths from other classic films, do not forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the bell.